There's a growing political gap between men and women, and if we're not careful, it'll lead to America's collapse.
Young men are going more conservative, young women are going slightly more progressive.
So to learn more, I interviewed influential voices on both sides and even asked both young men and women to see if this growing divide is true. To find out what impact will this have not only in the States, but around the world. And I wanted to ask Destiny, is this divide something that can even be fixed? Why do you hate centrists?
Most people that are centrists are just Trump sycophants, but they're too afraid or ashamed to admit it, or they want all of the virtue and aesthetic of being a nonpartisan before they come out and like super partisanly support Trump. It happens every single time. As soon as somebody says they're a centrist,
you're the only person in the world who can be a centrist? Or
in the online world, give me one.
Me.
Actually, I can think, well, I don't know. I'd have to go through your political views. But give me like one other media guy who's like a centrist. Who, when I was on Piers Morgan and Dave Smith was like, yeah, you know, I think I'm going to have to support Trump. Wow, go figure. When Tim Pool was like, yeah, I think I'm going to have to support Trump. Wow, go figure. Every single one of these centrist dudes, all of them came out and supported Trump. Isn't that crazy? You'd think if they were centrist, wouldn't it be like 50-50 or at least like 30-70 instead of every single one coming out to support Donald Trump?
Okay. Well, if you want to apply that logic, doesn't that not make you centrist because you voted for Kamala?
I have different beliefs that could put me on the left or the right, depending upon what you're looking at. You know, I think that trans people are real. I think that making medication available to even minors who are trans, I think could be valuable for people that, you know, if you can figure out who's actually trans and want to transition earlier, I think that's fine. But I also think that like men are men and women are women. And I think there are real biological differences between the two. You can't just like lump them all together and say they're the same. I think it's really dumb. Like I have a variety of opinions that could put me on the left or the right, depending upon which like constellation of beliefs you're picking from. But most people that call themselves centrists are just 100% aligned with this anti-establishment Trump dick suck mentality. And that's it. Again, the problem is the true enemies are people like you, okay? Unironically though, like you're no, but because you're so obsessed with trying to both sides everything. And it's like, it's an impossible world to live in because then people like you look at me like, aren't you kind of biased, Destiny? No, I don't think I am biased. Compared to the party that doesn't even acknowledge the results of the 2020, 2024, or 2016 election, Donald Trump still thinks all three elections were rigged. And you're asking me if I'm the biased one, right? Like in 2016, he said that 3 million illegal immigrants voted with no evidence. Put together a commission to find it, couldn't find it, disbanded the commission. In 2020, he says that the election was rigged. They launched 60 plus court cases to try to prove that, lost basically every single one. In 2024, Donald Trump was still saying that there was like evidence of rigging at the Philadelphia place in Detroit. They were bringing no evidence was ever good presented for any of this. None of it was proven, right? And then you're like, well, don't you think you're being a little bit biased? And say, no, the right is full of fucking liars right now and crazy people. So I don't think that I'm biased by calling that out. Nobody on the right will criticize Donald Trump substantively for anything. That's why you can't even give me a single example. I can rattle off 5 or 10 criticisms of Kamala Harris off the top of my head for things that I don't like. You will never find the same criticisms for people on the right. Like it just doesn't happen. I challenge you to do any of it. Other than like they'll give these like very like, well, I don't like that Donald Trump is kind of mean sometimes. Like they'll give some shit like that, but they won't disagree with them on any policy.
Thank you for saying that I'm part of the problem, but I do think this is exactly why it's important to talk to both sides.
Yeah, and I regret a lot of it. This is not valuable. The talking to both sides is not valuable because then it gives the air of illusion that both sides are somehow coming to some middle ground agreement. There is no coming to a middle ground or agreement with people on the right who think that the last election was still stolen.
And one thing to realize is that young people's votes are only going to become more important. Because if you look at the statistics, is that by 2028, 18 to 34-year-old voters are going to represent half of the total electorate compared to the 1/5 that we have today. But again, why are these young voters who for generations tended to lean more liberal now moving to opposite ends and becoming more politically involved than any other generation before?
Why is this happening? Well, we put the reasons into 2 different buckets. One is the life experiences that young men and young women are having. Those life experiences are diverging.
So I'll explore it all, but I already have a couple theories. My first thought is that the political spectrum is always shifting, and so does the grift with it. And if the goal of these parties is always to get more power, they're obviously always going to cater to the people that makes it easiest to achieve that. Like here's one example, right? As we're seeing a lot more men are starting to become more conservative. Am I the only one that's noticed like the rise in these conventionally attractive conservative influencers from anywhere from like the trad wife movement to homesteading to now even alternative health? And the left does it too, right? With like the whole body positivity movement, feminist influencers that obviously target women because look, there ain't no fat positivity for men. So I can say all that and investigate it, but I also wanted to look at myself too, because is choosing to be the centrist or independent also a grift in its own right? Because am I just doing the same, or am I just also afraid to tell you what side I'm maybe even more aligned with and both sizing everything to death just for the sake of it? I'll reveal what I concluded by the end of the video. But first, I wanted to see exactly why men are starting to become more conservative. Because even though young people still generally tend to be more liberal, in the past decade, young men have stopped following this trend. And there are three main reasons for this shift, which also explain why young women are moving to the left. And I think the first big thing is the feeling that liberals have abandoned men and at times even pushed a negative narrative. Why do you think young men are becoming more conservative?
I mean, the right has done a really good job at targeting young men for content, at least from what I see online, and the left has kind of done a poor job at targeting young men, and it's probably pushed a lot of, especially young white men, away.
It seems like you have a decent amount of like influence. Why hasn't that kind of like translated in terms of like polling? Or why do you feel like so many other like young men are trending towards different voices?
This isn't even really necessarily to do with men, but I think in the left, when there are power structures, they're very quick to attack the entire group that they view as being at the top of that power structure, and then it makes every single person involved in that group feel like it's not a party for them, you know? So whether they're attacking white people or attacking America or attacking men, you just kind of get this, or wealthy people or whatever. I think too much of the left is focused on like chastising or punishing or criticizing rather than saying like, like, hey, this is a majority power group. Like, here's how other people can, kind of like rise up too, instead of just like relentlessly attacking them.
I think especially for the men here, we've all heard by this point all the messaging on anti-patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And I think it's very legitimate that men feel very demonized for any sense of masculinity. But I think the most blatant example can be seen in the official website of the Democratic Party.
Guess which demographic doesn't appear once? No men. Not a single man.
Now, let's be real. I don't think many men read this and was like, all right, I'm going to vote Republican now. But the absence of men in the Democratic Party's who we serve does show that men aren't necessarily wrong for feeling left out by liberals. And it's completely natural that whenever people feel left out, they're naturally going to seek community elsewhere. And increasingly, young men are finding that online. And they've definitely found some positive voices, but also some that were ready to capitalize.
Andrew Tate is the world's most viral misogynist.
Rip her up by the neck.
This has been talked about to death, but I think the wrong way many people looked at Andrew Tate's rise is how could men look up to this misogynistic piece of shit, but instead of looking at it as why so many did resonate with him. Because even though I don't think that someone who talks about having multiple kids with multiple women and flashing cards is like the best representation of masculinity and definitely not the best representation of conservatism, it does reveal the symptom that a lot of men are longing for some sort of message around masculinity that doesn't make them feel demonized. And look, I'm not the only one who's noticed this. Some of the biggest liberal voices have noticed this too.
There is a massive amount of right-wing radicalization that has been occurring, especially in younger male spaces. Everything is completely dominated by right-wing politics. If you're a dude under the age of 30 and you have any hobbies, every single facet of that is just completely dominated by center-right.
You're very different in that sense, though. Like, you're very willing to challenge like other people's voices. Like, do you feel like the left doesn't do a good job of that? Why do you feel like they shy away from talking to people that they disagree with?
I think for a long time, I think the left was kind of like winning the culture war. So there was this kind of built-in assumption that everything they were saying was right and correct. And so they didn't have to defend any of their ideas, or they didn't have to actually deal with anybody that was challenging them. So they just didn't. And then they got into the habit of that.
And with this growing political gap, it's clear that the media bias makes it hard to discern even what truth is. I mean, there's a reason why we have an all-time low trust in media. That's why I've been using my sponsor, Straight Arrow News. Straight Arrow News is a free app and website that highlights not only left and right-leaning opinions, but most importantly, gives me an unbiased view of stories from all sides. And trust me, I need sources that focus on facts and not the fluff. And that's why I actually used it to research this very video and even to write our newsletter. And so I genuinely stand by this sponsor because when you download the free Straight Arrow News app, you're not just supporting me, you're also supporting a group of journalists that are dedicated just like I am to bridging the gap. So go to san.com/gen or use my link in the description to download the free app to stay informed. And this leads me perfectly to how young men were further influenced, especially in this election, by media voices that weren't necessarily too political or one-sided in recent memory. This year, compared to 2016 to 2020, we saw lots of media figures from especially comedians and podcasters show their support for Trump. in front of their primarily male audiences, from Andrew Schultz on the Flagrant podcast to Theo Vaughn. And both of these platforms are absolutely massive, but most importantly, we saw it with Joe Rogan just a few days before the election.
Young people are rejecting a lot of this woke bullshit. They're tired of these people that they think are mentally ill telling them what the moral standards of society should be today. People are upset.
And if the reports are true that Trump's son Barron was actually pushing his father to go on these specific types of podcasts, clearly, whether it be the election or just looking at it from the views alone, it was obviously successful. And just as I was finishing writing this, I just saw this TikTok of Charlie Kirk essentially breaking down how this was a deliberate media strategy on his point with Turning Point.
And Donald Trump's campaign strategy, of which we helped execute on the ground in some of these states, was that, guys, don't spend your time knocking on doors about a suburban soccer mom who's weighing her options. Go spend your time in very Republican areas where there are non-registered or what we call disengaged voters. People that like Trump, like his worldview. For example, the bro vote, right? We harvested in a very, very powerful way. At Arizona State University, for example, we registered thousands of young men to vote in fraternities. And that was way easier than us going to try to win over swing voters. And we did a little bit of that, but generally the Trump campaign was brilliant because they threw the Republican consultant playbook out.
Is if I had to bet a lot of money, I'm sure that a lot more young men were influenced by these sorts of voices, rather than someone like Harry Sisson, who was handpicked and paid by the Democratic Party to connect to a young Gen Z audience. But it's overly simplistic to just look at the media alone. Young men simply just care about different issues than women do.
So I saw like your recent interview with Piers Morgan, and I think just in general, right, men tend to care more about economic issues. And I think you made the claim that the left has righted the ship in metrics like inflation, unemployment compared to other countries. But if that's the case, why didn't young men vote for the left in this election?
I think people kind of care about economic issues. People care about what they think about the economic issues. And for a long time, the right has basically been allowed to operate, with impunity in terms of just lying and telling people how they feel about certain things. And there definitely was huge inflation rates in the beginning parts of the Biden administration, and cumulatively a lot of that inflation is still felt. But then when you add on to that all of the basically fake news that the right is allowed to sell on all of their platforms over and over again, and nobody really calls them out on it, then people are going to have a worse view of how things are going than they actually are.
What's the lies? What are the fake news? What are the specific examples?
Literally almost everything. If you get into the specifics, if I argue with somebody, for instance, if I say where did inflation come from? Literally no conservative will acknowledge that COVID was even a thing in terms of being a huge influencing factor for inflation. A lot of people have dumb ideas around macroeconomics. They'll say the Federal Reserve is why inflation happens, and we need to get rid of the Federal Reserve, ignoring the fact that Donald Trump, enjoyed low interest rates under his administration and will continue to push for low interest rates when he's coming in. They'll say things like tariffs will help control inflation, even though tariffs are an added tax across our entire import market. It will increase inflation.
So I guess how has the left done things differently than the right? How can the left, for example, take ownership or credit for the economic issues improving, right? Because I think this is important to outline, because you're right. Because for example, right, a lot of young men, I think, tend to view the right as being able to right the ship better when it comes to economic policies. So there must be some reason for that.
Yeah, it's a totally fantastical delusion. It's just not true. Democrats have always had to come in and right the ship from failing conservative administrations. Obama had to do it. Obama had to come in after the 2007-2008 housing collapse. Everybody remembers this was a worldwide economic meltdown. Obama came in, righted the ship. The economy was doing pretty good his second term and continued to do good. And then Trump comes in, and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my God, amazing economy under Trump. It was amazing for the last 4 years of Obama and continued on through Trump. And Trump only had to be more amazing by doing even more deficit spending. He cut taxes. He didn't pair it with spending cuts. He spent money like crazy. And then at the end of Trump's administration, you had COVID, which left the entire world economy again in shambles. And then Biden comes in. We've got the American Rescue Plan. The United States is outperforming every other economy in the world, and nobody cares. And now Trump is going to come in again, and it's probably going to be Trump taking credit for, oh my God, look at all this infrastructure we're building. Yeah, because Biden passed the infrastructure bill. Oh my God, we finally got, manufacturing back from China for microprocessors. Yeah, because Biden passed the CHIPS Act.
I'll get into why this is the case, but first we need to understand several factors. There is a growing education gap where only 40% of young graduates are now men. And look, I've actually gone and graduated to college, so I feel I can say this in that I'm not the biggest advocate of college, but the fact of the matter is young men without college degrees are definitely facing record low employment.
Young men without a college degree have seen the greatest decline in labor force participation. Meanwhile, a record 87% of college-educated women are in the workforce. And today, women make up 60% of college graduates.
And so when you understand that, economically, this is going to become a great dividing factor. Because when the other side is offering, let's say, student loan forgiveness with tax money, why would men who never went to college care about that? And when liberals are the ones offering more economic policies like student loan forgiveness funded by tax money, of course you're not going to care if you're a man who didn't go to college. And when you also look closer and look at how a lot more men are in labor jobs, these jobs are a lot more dependent on global economic policies, anywhere from tariffs to even outsourcing. So when we look at all that, it makes sense why this gap is also happening worldwide. Even in Scandinavian countries where it's considered one of the more equal societies in the world, men are now as far behind as women in education as women were behind men globally in 1970s. So now the women. Because what I found are similar reasons, but slightly opposite. So just like I asked Destiny, a liberal guy, I wanted to talk to someone else on the other side that was also deviating from the gender gap trend. So I decided to ask Paula Scanlon, a conservative girl and an ambassador for the Independent Women's Forum and a former swimmer at UPenn with Leah Thomas.
My teammates and I were forced to undress in the presence of Leah, a 6'4" tall biological male, fully intact with male genitalia. When we tried to voice our concerns to the athletic department, we were told that Leah's swimming and being in our locker room was a non-negotiable.
Because if it wasn't for particular life experiences, would Paula been the same? Why do you think young women are becoming more liberal?
I think the biggest thing is that women are more torn on emotions. It's what I saw on my team, right? So many people would say, oh, well, like Leah Thomas is going to kill himself or herself, whatever. You know, you don't accept it. And then people are like, oh, I can't have that. I can't, or they call you a horrible person if you don't accept it. And so people would buy into that. And so I noticed even on my own swim team, the contrast between the men's team and the women's team, the men would be like, what the hell is this? This is insane. And the women would be like, oh, but we need to be caring. But the other shift that people have noticed is women are traditionally more religious than men are.
Just like men, they're influenced by media, no doubt. But the influence there is a little bit different, and it's also changing. Women today have more voice than ever, and to go along with it, unify movements that aren't really seen on the men's side. The hashtag #MeToo movement, for example, exposed instances of gender inequalities and actual instances of people going through assault through personal stories. And this also came with its bad and its good, but it also did expose a lot of bad people doing bad shit. But more importantly, it actually unified a lot more women under liberal and progressive views. And this in turn is one of the movements that has led to young women's participation in politics, but in some ways it also has led to extremes, where for some women, this became a conclusion from toxic masculinity to all men are trash to even
we need to kill all men.
So that's clearly an example of an extreme woman, but reactions after Trump's elections also show how these movements shape what each gender values most.
So many other women in America who have been considering trying to get pregnant. I woke up today and said, nope, not anymore.
This woman is actually shaving her head in protest. It's being called the 4B movement, and women are taking to social media declaring their allegiance.
So again, obviously these are also a lot of instances of extreme women, but I don't care who the hell you are. If you're literally setting up a camera, pressing record, crying, screaming, and then editing it, looking through the footage, and then posting it on TikTok. Yeah, you're fucking crazy and you're lost in the sauce. But anyways, as you may have noticed, some of these women were even inspired by South Korea's 4B movement, a feminist movement advocating for women to abstain from dating, marriage, sexual relationships, and childbirth as a protest against patriarchal structures. And so I know a lot of you Americans, which is like around 50% of my audience, probably only look at the United States, but what you can see here is that how powerful media is now in even increasingly spreading movements that have happened in another country. Which brings me to media. The biggest female podcaster today is arguably Call Her Daddy, which makes sense why Kamala decided to go on her podcast. Beyond that, Kamala also received major endorsements from major female celebrities from Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Meg Thee Stallion to even Cardi B. Did these endorsements really change anything or sway the moderate or independent women or men? Or were they already just preaching to an already liberal-leaning women audience? Because I have to imagine none of these big artists are going to decide to take on this endorsement if they already didn't know that the majority of their audience leans left already, or else it'll be career suicide. So I think it's a fair question, is that although these women probably look up to these figures, are any of them really going there for political advice? Because if I had to imagine, endorsements are there to sway voters that are undecided or maybe even on the opposite side, which are conservative. So again, all this is a bit speculative, I'll admit to that, but one thing is for certain, and it's that the difference in what issues women care about.
For young women, the top issue is abortion. By a lot.
As a woman, why do you think abortion became such a central issue besides like the obvious reasons?
One thing is like each election, right, they're obviously going to play on something that's happened recently, right? So like in 2020, there was so much about BLM and George Floyd and because it had been a recent event. I think obviously Roe v. Wade overturned in 2022. It was really just the talking point that could continue to hit home. So if you look at Kamala Harris's Twitter account or X, whatever you want to call it, there were so many tweets saying, you know, Trump's abortion bans or Trump's overturning of Roe v. Wade. If you look at her account, it was like all that they were saying. And so I think it's what they knew that their issue that people would vote on, because again, it was a very recent thing. But again, I think it's just it happening so recently, right? So this is the first election, presidential election that we've had since that happened. They needed to just hang on to that. And hasn't that been what's happened in every election, right? Like, it's just whatever the most recent sort of cultural, social event is, people are going to push on that.
Unlike a lot of young men, young women focus more on, let's say, social issues, from reproductive rights, gender equality to climate. As you expect, since conservatives have quite a different view on all of those topics, what we've seen is more women having an even stronger rejection against conservative views. And how this is manifesting is in dating. Many women are way less likely than men to partner up with someone with different views. And instead, they like seeking partners with similar political values.
Would you ever date someone who is liberal?
I have, and I won't do it again.
Why is that?
To keep it completely real, I don't want to have to work. I want to be a stay-at-home mom. And most liberal men don't want to provide
split the check.
That. Yeah, they want it, it's like more 50-50, and I don't want it to be 50-50.
Would you ever date someone who's on the opposite political spectrum as you? Yeah, that's a no. That's a no.
Probably not.
And as I mentioned earlier with men, this growing education gap is also a major factor. Women now make up 60% in a majority of college graduates.
Or if you're looking at people like at higher level degrees, women are going to grad school more often, women are getting undergraduate degrees more often. And we've seen this election, there is a correlation between people who vote Democrat and people who are college educated and
there's a huge
above
divide
that.
in education. Yeah.
Yeah, and women are the ones who are getting degrees now.
And when you consider that, they're also generally way less likely to date someone who also didn't go to college like they did. So as more women pursue higher education and careers while men are lagging behind, just like how men do, women are also going to vote and support on policies that support their aspirations and experiences, which again aligns them further with liberal policies. So before I move on to my conclusions about what impact this divide will have now and in the future, because yes, we can always hear about stats and polls, and honestly, how accurate are those these days? I want to test this for myself by asking the streets on what political party they support and whether that's changed over the years.
What political party do you support?
I tend to lean towards Republican.
So has that changed like over the years? Because it does go with a trend that young men in general are becoming more conservative.
Being Mexican, my whole family was Democrat. So growing up, everyone was Democrat and we were told, Democrat's the right side. As I've grown into a late teenager, early 20s, I've turned to more Republican.
A lot of Latino men caught a lot of flack for voting for Trump. Why do you think there has been such like a big shift, even especially for Latinos?
No, I mean, I think it goes more than just being a Latino. I think it's just men in general. The left end of the political agenda has kind of started to become anti-men in some instances. Not very left, but far left is very anti-men. And not just Latinos, but blacks and white people. All see they kind of want to distance themselves from that. And also the left being very pro-border. Being a Mexican, even I can see it's not a great idea to let everyone in, because not everyone's a good apple.
So we outlined why I think this gap is growing, but the question is this only going to get worse, and why the hell should we care? In 1999, so around 20 years ago, more women still did lean more liberal, but what's different is that an equal 46% of them, of both young women and men, identified as conservative. But today, 58% of women aged 18 to 34 identify as liberal compared to just 24% of women as conservative. And if we flip it over, while 37% of young men lean and identify as liberal, 42% is conservative today. So when you look at these numbers, we can conclude that the gap is actually mainly a result of women becoming more liberal rather than men shifting more right. And this ideological gap is even resulting in geographical differences. Red areas are becoming redder, blue areas bluer, and as people live in their own circles, they're now being less exposed to opposing ideas. And as I've talked about throughout, this is causing serious effects that's now impacting everyone in the world. The US birth rate has steadily declined to 1.6 children per woman, below the 2.1 that is needed to maintain a stable population without needing immigration. And in some countries like South Korea and Italy, it's way worse. What do you think are like the long-term effects of young women and men continuing to drift further apart politically?
Again, I think what people have looked at studies in other countries that this is happening in too, people aren't getting married and then like the birth rates are really bad. I do think we all agree more than we think we do, but it's becoming more and more polarizing. So like looking at it on paper, it's become this huge divide. It's been super polarizing, all this. I think we do agree, we just don't see that we agree. And I think that that's making it really hard. And again, if people aren't willing to date conservatives, if they're liberal and vice versa, that is problematic, especially if there is such a gender divide.
In the end, having families and kids is obviously each person's choice. But with falling birth rates that are caused by other factors like economics, as well as this widening gender gap, I think to me it becomes more than a liberal or conservative issue. Everyone falls when we refuse to form families and look to build strong communities. And even though to different degrees, both men and women care about an economic decline that's gonna come with labor shortages of having to support an aging population. Because the fact is, when we talk about building a more equal and fair society that I think everyone can get along with, we can't ignore the biggest advantage that someone can have today, which is growing up in a two-parent household. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think, because I grew up in a two-parent household and I can see these advantages the older that I get.
Would you be willing to admit if, like, let's say Trump absolutely changes America in 2024 in this next term, that he's actually a good president, or would the past events in your eyes always cloud that judgment?
I mean, I'm always going to rate somebody on the whole, but the problem is that like Trump, the next 4 years are going to be pretty good for America. Like, I think Biden has set us up very well. But now all of these like Trump dick sucks that were saying things like the GDP doesn't matter, that doesn't capture my life, or the stock market only matters for billionaires. All these same dipshits are going to be spamming all-time highs on the stock market because of Donald Trump. Oh, look at the GDP growth, blah, blah, blah. All these same people who are like, why aren't the prices falling? I don't understand what the rate of change is. I don't know what that means when we say that inflation, are all going to be saying like, prices haven't changed at all. Like, actually, year-over-year inflation is actually so good, and I don't actually care if the prices fall, right? So it's, you know, it's like the economy is probably going to do pretty well for the next 4 years. We're coming out of, again, another economic catastrophe that happened under a conservative. And as things go well, Trump's going to want to take credit for all of it. And then people are going to come back to me. They're going to go, well, look, won't you admit at least that the economy ran well under Donald Trump? And I'll be like, yeah, I guess. But I mean, of course, it was always going to, as long as he doesn't fuck things up from where Biden left it.
You know, you made a couple of controversial statements during the Trump assassination attempt. Do you feel like you still stand by your statement that you have no sympathy for the bystander firefighter that was killed?
Yeah.
Why is that?
You're going to like an insane rally from a dude who is like championing violence against the United States. Like, yeah, if violence or whatever happens, then I mean, fuck it. I mean, it should happen.
You feel like it was justified that he was killed then?
No, I don't think you should ever kill people for political reasons in the United States. I don't think that's good. But I'm not gonna feel bad for you if you end up getting killed at some crazy fucking rally where you're cheering on some authoritarian lunatic. That's
so
fucking
you think
wild.
Someone can also make then the argument that then you should be canceled for having sort of statements like that?
Okay, they can try and cancel me then, I guess. I already get like 50 million death threats.
Like, that's why Tucker Carlson has like an audience too, right? Is that
hold on, wait. This has nothing to do. What I'm saying is Tucker Carlson had no credibility because he blatantly and knowingly lied to his audience in order to get a politician elected. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about right now.
So I guess you still stand by that statement then?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just maybe, simply said, this whole problem comes down to us focusing on the wrong things. The fact is, the political pendulum is always swinging. If the political party's job is to gain and maintain power, you can always bet that they will always shift their values to go along with it.
The culture shift between right and left authoritarianism, and now people don't recognize if you just stop looking at it in terms of red and blue, look at the actions, whether it's war, suppression of free speech, pharmacological interventions that are mandatory, whatever the fuck it is. That used to all be associated with the authoritarian right, and now those things are being embraced by the left.
Because if you're watching, I want you to take a look at your algorithm now. You're most likely in a bubble. Your feed this election was either 100% pro-Trump or pro-Kamala content. And instead of deciding and staying firm on your own values, we're more focused outsourcing and dick-riding political parties that sell you a subscription set of beliefs that you can follow. Because even though both sides will continue to give me shit for being an independent, I refuse to stop believing that when left to think for yourselves, most people lean left on some issues and right on others. And I don't really care which side the shift happened, but as we saw with the Latino vote in this election,
40% of Latino voters said the economy was their number one issue.
The last thing you should do is to just keep thinking because others say you should think this way. No group, whether men or women or Asian, white, Latino, or black, should ever be expected to just vote by default, because that's the easiest way for political parties to grift you. And so my message in this video isn't to just listen to me because I'm this wholly centrist or independent, but the message is just be careful. Because if you're only hearing things that confirm your beliefs, you're in the wrong room. And the longer that you stay in that room, the harder it becomes to think for yourself. So if you resonate with that, subscribe and download the free SNA app to change how society approaches issues. And one way you can support me is by joining our free weekly newsletter where we cut through the noise of news to give you that one big story that you need to know without the bias. Or if you want to just continue watching me yap, then you'll like this video too.